welcome. And yeah, feel free to join this presentation and the discussion afterwards. The floor, the virtual floor is all yours.
All right, thank you very much, Susie.
My pleasure.
Okay, so the topic today is reason and disgust, or generally perhaps the connection between reason and emotion when it comes to morality.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when we're talking about morality, we may ask what is morality rooted in, what it is grounded in, what is the core of morality? And we might say, well, is it at core a question of reason? Is it a rational thing to become moral, to do the right thing? Or are emotions involved to a certain extent? And of course, it's not really necessarily an either or. We might say reason is involved to a certain extent, has a certain role in morality, and emotions also play a role, a different role. But of course, the question is, what role exactly is the role of reason, if it plays a role, and what is the role of emotions, and what kind of emotions are relevant here? But in bioethics, there's a very strong current there that has reason as the foundation of morality. And an inclination to regard emotions as dispensable, as not really necessary in order to understand what is the right thing to do and also to do the right thing. So that case for reason as the foundation of morality is very strong. Morality is then understood as applied reason, so practical application of reason. Doing what is morally right is doing what is most reasonable to do. And that has, of course, a long tradition in moral philosophy. Think of Kant. Immanuel Kant, the idea that we could figure out what is the right thing to do by asking ourselves whether the maxim of our action can become a universal law, or whether we can want it to become a universal law. So the idea is here that if we do the right thing, we do what reason commands us to do, and to do the morally wrong thing is a kind of self-contradiction. So again, for Kant, morality is nothing but practical reason. It's nothing else than that. Now, utilitarianism, the great rival of a Kantian style ethics, might not at first glance be so, how should I say, connected or committed to the idea that reason is the basis of morality. But if you look at Jeremy Bentham and how he argued for utilitarianism, you will also see that Bentham basically argued that the only reasonable moral philosophy, the only reasonable ethics is utilitarianism. Why is that? Because when you ask, why is this wrong? Why should I not do this? Then at some stage you will have to point to some harm that is being inflicted on someone. And that harm, if you want to know what that harm consists in, you will at some point have to refer to some kind of suffering or pain, or the absence of happiness, absence of well-being, subjective well-being. Everything else is irrational. If I just say God doesn't want it, that is not good enough, because I need to have a reason why I should not do what God doesn't want me to do. Or if I say it's against nature, then I need a reason. I need to explain why I shouldn't do what is against nature. While Bentham argues, when I say it causes pain, it makes someone suffer, then this is immediately obvious and the only rational foundation for morality. So we see this here too. Now, if you look at utilitarianism, what utilitarianism tells us we should do, or how we should figure out what is the right thing to do, then it sounds eminently reasonable. We should maximize happiness because happiness is a good thing. We all want to be happy. So happiness or subjective well-being is good. Therefore, the more we have of it, the better. We should do what is best for all things considered, rather than just a few, because everyone is equal and deserves the same thing. Everyone deserves to be happy, and everyone should count for one and not for more than one. So we should, if engaged in deciding what we should do as a society or a state, we should try to secure the best outcome for all. That seems reasonable enough. However, if you look at the consequences in certain situations, you will see that it might lead, this seemingly very reasonable doctrine might lead to unpalatable consequences. And I very much recommend that people read this particular treatise by Jonathan Swift, the Anglo-Irish writer in the early 18th century. Jonathan Swift is widely known as the author of Gulliver's Travels. I'm sure you've heard of that one. But he also wrote an essay that is called A Modest Proposal for Preventing the Children of Poor People from being a burden to their parents or the country, and for making them beneficial to the public. So it's a very long, very baroque title. The essay was published anonymously in 1729. And in that essay, Swift, or rather the narrator, the anonymous author, argues that we should solve the problem of poverty in Ireland by allowing the poor Irish Catholics to raise their children or produce children for food for the rich Anglo-Irish landowners. Now that sounds cruel, it sounds inhumane, but the interesting thing about the argument is that it's very, very rational, and the author argues from a utilitarian perspective by arguing that this would be in the best interest of everyone involved, because the poor people would no longer be that poor, we would money, the children would be spared the suffering of growing up, or rather mostly dying in poverty, dying of starvation, because many did die of starvation at the time. So it was a huge social and humane crisis in Ireland at the time. We had those rich Protestant landowners who had everything, and the vast majority of Catholics who were poor and on the brink of starving. So in that situation, Swift made that suggestion. Okay, we can solve that problem by having the poor produce children for food for the rich. And he argued, well, that might be seen as inhumane, but given that there's no chance that anything will change in the situation as it is, that is really the best option we have. So it's a kind of realism there, but also the argument that something is in the best interest of everyone, all things considered. And that is a typically utilitarian kind of reasoning. And it's very rational. So the author, it's clear that the author, the fictional author, is not a cruel man. He doesn't show any joy in making these recommendations. He just declares that this is, rationally speaking, the best possible scenario. Now, how do we react to that? Well, most people would say, well, this is horrible, right? We cannot do this. This is indecent. It's a nightmare scenario. But why exactly? It's difficult to say. But what is easy to say is that this rational approach, this purely rational approach, leads here to consequences that we cannot accept if we want to keep our humanity and our decency.
Yes.
Now, this was swift a long time ago, but today we have sometimes similar proposals coming up based on very rational or very rationally seeming arguments. And I want to give you one example. This is a paper published 7 years ago by Alberto Gibolini and Francesca Minerva. It's called After Birth Abortion, Why Should the Baby Live? And the title already tells you what the argument is likely to be. Namely, the authors argue that newborn babies don't have a right to live, and we should be allowed, or parents should be allowed, to kill them if they for some reason decide they don't want to have that baby. Right? It's like abortion just after birth. And what is being assumed here is a certain liberal ethical outlook according to which abortion is okay. Now, the reason for that is very much based in a very common, again, utilitarian and rationalist kind of reasoning in bioethics. And mind you, again, just for clarification, what they argue is not that we should be allowed to kill a newborn child when the circumstances are such that the child is likely to suffer a lot. So it's not for reasons of sparing the child any suffering. No, it's for perfectly healthy children. We should be allowed, or parents should be allowed, to kill them if they decide they don't want to. Why is that? Here's the argument. Just like an unborn child, a newborn has no interest to speak of, and certainly is, and I quote here, not in the condition of attributing any value to their own existence. Yet if they cannot do that, then they lack those properties that justify the attribution of a right to life of an individual. So basically, a right to life has a certain foundation in the characteristics, the properties that an entity has. And if those properties are absent, then the right is also absent. So supposedly, a newborn baby, just like an unborn baby, a fetus in the mother's womb, doesn't have what it takes to have a right to life. Therefore, they argue by killing, in quotation marks, by killing a newborn child, we do not actually kill anyone at all. It is more like failing to bring a new person into existence, which is clearly not morally wrong. And to conclude, since non-persons have no moral rights to life, ending the life of such a non-person is entirely permissible. And we don't, and the main point here is we don't need any good reason. We can just do it if we feel like it. Now, I hope that most of you will agree that that is a consequence we do not want to draw. It's, again, something that is very unpalatable, something that violates our sense of morality. Because we are used to see babies not as not worthy or not deserving of our protection, but on the contrary. On the contrary, we feel that in this particular state, in their vulnerability, the extreme vulnerability, they actually deserve more protection than an adult or an older child who can also fend for themselves. So it's a very vulnerability in that particular state that makes us feel that it is even more wrong to kill a newborn baby than, for instance, an adult person. Now, as might have been predicted, but was for some reason not expected by the authors, there was public outrage after that paper was published. So lots of people thought this was horrendous to make such an argument and to claim that it would be perfectly all right to kill babies. And then the authors defended themselves and strangely and not very credibly argued that their argument was purely academic and had never been intended to influence public policy. It's very strange because if you come out with a paper, then usually you do want people to take notice and take it seriously. So in a way, they're saying here, we never meant for anyone to take this seriously, which was actually the case with Jonathan Swift. Just to clarify, he didn't mean what he wrote in that modest proposal. Right? But Ghibellini and Minerva meant exactly what they wrote there. Okay, so anyway, they said, well, actually, it was purely academic, whatever that means. And Julian Savulescu, who was the editor at the time of the journal in which the paper was published, also defended the authors and said, all the authors did is present a well-reasoned argument based on widely accepted premises and proceed logically from those premises to certain conclusions. So it's all very, very reasonable. And he's right. It is, well, it is a reasoned argument. To what extent is a well-reasoned argument is a different question, but it is a reasoned argument and it is based on widely accepted premises. So far, that is true. But then there are a lot of things, a lot of actions that we consider morally wrong, even though we don't really have a rational basis for that. For instance, we don't kill our babies for fun, and we think that is morally wrong to do that. We treat our dead with respect. We don't use their flesh for Sunday roasts or their skin for lampshades. And anyone who did that, we would be appalled by that. But of course, we might say, well, why? Well, what's all the fuss about? I mean, they're dead. They don't feel anything, right? You can't harm them. You can't make them suffer, whatever you do to them. It's just a piece of meat or skin or bones or whatever. It's just material and should be able to use it any way you like. But again, if someone made that seemingly perfectly rational argument, we would not say, yeah, they're right. Or we might say they're right, rationally speaking, but it's still a horrendous thing to do. And it's worth thinking about why that is. So we might have certain emotions, and I'm not saying that we should just take those emotions at face value. We can think about it, but we can use those emotions of being appalled, being disgusted by a certain suggestion as a starting point to start a reflection. Another example, we think that killing someone harms them. Now, that is obviously something that almost everyone agrees that this is wrong. And also that we do something bad to the person we kill. And I'm not talking about what happens before they're actually dead, right? They might suffer or they might experience fear or whatever. We don't think that it's just wrong to make people suffer before they die or to make them be afraid before they die. We think the greatest wrong, the greatest harm we inflict on them is by bringing them into a situation where they're no longer there. So the being dead is supposed to be a harm. But it's very difficult to see how being dead can be harmful for someone, mostly because there is no someone who could be harmed by it when you're dead, right? It's a very old argument going back to Epicurus, and of course countless philosophers have taken this on and tried to show how Epicurus is wrong and there is harm in being killed. But none of those arguments is entirely convincing. It feels like an ad hoc solution to the problem. We want to have a reason. We want to find a rational reason for why it's wrong to kill people. So these are a few examples where we find it difficult to rationally argue the wrongness of what we feel very strongly is wrong. But then it's not all morality fundamentally irrational. David Hume famously said in his treatise, "It is not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my finger." He's not saying this is not wrong. He's saying it's not contrary to reason. There's nothing contradictory or illogical or irrational about wanting everyone else to die and preferring everyone else to die to any harm coming to me. And that is the essence of morality, that I take, that I consider what happens to other people, and then that I take this into account and take it seriously and care about it, right? But it's not irrational not to care about what happens to other people. So the whole moral outlook might not be based in rationality and reason. And if you look carefully at the arguments that are being proposed and that appear to be rational at first glance, if you look, for instance, at Ghibellini and Minerva's argument, it is not really rational. It's not logically compelling. That is what Savulescu, when he defended his authors, said, right? It logically follows from those premises, but it doesn't. Just as from the fact that somebody attributes value to their life and is capable of making aims, it does not logically follow that they have a right to life. Neither does it follow logically from the fact that an entity is not capable of doing so, that it has no right to life. Right to life might be grounded in something completely different. So there is no logical connection. Now, at the time when Ghibellini and Minerva's paper was published, I wrote a paper in which I responded to the argument, right, which was published in the Hastings Center report. And then I got reactions, and those reactions were very interesting because I was attacked by both those who thought abortion is completely legitimate and there's nothing morally wrong with it, and those who thought that abortion, and of course also after-birth abortion or infanticide, is crime. It's tantamount to murder, right? It has the same moral, it's on the same moral level as murder. So we have those two parties, right? Those who think abortion is perfectly okay, and those who think abortion is a terrible crime. And both attack me for saying that morality is not based on reason. So I was attacked by the authors and their philosophical allies, but also by Don Marquis, who claims that there is at least one argument against the moral permissibility of infanticide that should be utterly compelling to any rational person. And he doesn't elaborate on what that argument is, but presumably it's his own argument, which basically says that abortion is wrong because it deprives the child of a future. But obviously, this argument cannot be utterly compelling to any rational person unless we declare everyone who thinks that abortion is okay to be irrational. But of course, those people also think that their argument is utterly compelling to any rational person. Minerva and Ghibellini and Savulescu think that the argument for afterbirth abortion is utterly compelling to any rational person. Don Marquis thinks that the opposite argument, that abortion is always wrong, is utterly compelling rationally. It's not possible, if there's anything rationally compelling, is that those two claims cannot both be true. So that just shows that the idea that an argument is rationally compelling is usually not true. It is only rationally compelling to those who feel a certain way about a situation. Don Marquis feels very strongly that abortion is wrong. And perhaps Ghibellini and Minerva and Savulescu feel very strongly that it isn't. And then a particular argument seems rationally compelling to them because they have those feelings. That brings us to disgust. Now, disgust is a very strong emotion, and it's just here an example of an emotion that we might have when we're confronted with cases where a moral law is being violated that we feel particularly strongly about. So certain things that are particularly violent, particularly inhumane, particularly cruel, often arouse an emotion very much like disgust in us. We are morally disgusted. We are repulsed by what is happening. So disgust, repugnance, a very strong, almost physical aversion to a certain action. But of course, it is difficult to argue that we should always heed our emotions of disgust, in the sense that if we're disgusted by something, we can be sure it's wrong and it shouldn't be done, because people tend to be disgusted by all kinds of things, right? Homosexuality, mixed race marriages, or what have you, right? There are various things that people can develop a disgust towards. And of course, we have to think about this. And in bioethics, there's a very strong tendency, again, a rationalist tendency, to declare disgust to be not only irrelevant for morality, but rather as a force that stands in the way of making the right moral decisions, or even understanding and realizing what is the morally right thing to do. Martha Nussbaum, for instance, writes in Hiding from Humanity, "The really civilized nation must make a strenuous effort to counter the power of disgust as a barrier to the full equality and mutual respect of all citizens." And there is some truth to that, right? There are certain forms of disgust that we should get rid of if possible. However, disgust can also be a moral marker, can, as I said earlier, be an indication that there's something seriously wrong, even though we feel unable at the time to put our finger exactly on it, where exactly it is wrong, or why it is exactly wrong. William Miller, in his book, The Anatomy of Disgust, writes, "Disgust is more than just a motivator of good taste. It marks out moral matters for which we can have no compromise. Disgust signals our being appalled, signals the fact that we are paying more than lip service. Its presence lets us know we are truly in the grip of the norm whose violation we are witnessing or imagining. To articulate one's disgust is to do more than state a preference or simply reveal a sensation in our bodies." And finally, another quote, Mary Mitchley, a British philosopher who sadly died last year, wrote many wonderful books that, again, I strongly recommend you read if you get the chance. Mary Mitchley, in her book Heart and Mind, writes, "We cannot really think injustice is bad if it does not at some point sicken us." So again, this is almost a physical reaction that is required if you really understand the wrongness, the degree and the kind of wrongness that some actions have. Another quote from Mitchley from her book, from her paper, Biotechnology and Monstrosity. "Whenever we seriously judge something to be wrong, strong feeling necessarily accompanies a judgment. Someone who does not have such feelings, someone who has merely a theoretical interest in morals, who doesn't feel any indignation or disgust and outrage about things like slavery and torture, has missed the point of morals altogether. So this is not just something that might indicate where something is wrong or that something is wrong, but something that itself is morally required, right? So that you don't have those feelings, then something is wrong with you, morally wrong with you. And ethics, rational ethics, can be completely inadequate in dealing with certain violations of moral norms. For instance, suppose that someone commits a horrible crime, say torturing, killing, and mutilating a child just for the fun of it. Right? Imagine that situation. And I'm sure everyone will think this is horrible, right? A horrible thing. But now you ask an ethicist to explain why it is wrong. Right? Normally we don't have any need to get this explained. But say we do ask an ethicist, and first we ask a Kantian. And the Kantian says, well, obviously their action violated the categorical imperative, and its maxim is not universalizable. I'd say, what? Are you serious? This is why torturing and mutilating and killing the child is wrong? You must be kidding. Then we ask another ethicist, and the ethicist says, it was wrong, but not because of what the Kantian just told you. It's wrong because it didn't increase the net sum of happiness in the universe. Again, we would say, this is hopelessly inadequate. This doesn't capture at all the wrongness, again, the nature and the degree of the wrongness we are trying to understand. So we need more than the rational explanation why this is wrong. We need something more, and that more is primarily given through our emotions and the strength of our emotions. But the question, of course, remains, because we are philosophers and we try to make sense of things, and that also means rational sense of things. We need to think about these things. And when we do, we find that it's not easy to distinguish between disgust that is an indicator, or perhaps even something that is required to be properly moral, to be properly responsive to the situation in its wrongness, and disgust that is immoral, that lets us, that prevents us from doing justice to people, that prevents us from letting people in and being fair and decent with them. So the moral disgust and the immoral disgust, how do we distinguish the two? Now we might say, or the rationalist bioethicist might now say, well, exactly, that's why we need reason. And then we apply reason, and then we figure out what is, when it is appropriate to be disgusted and when not. But once we have done that, we have given a rational reason why something is wrong, and then we don't need the disgust anymore, right? We can rely again on reason. But I think that is not the right question. It's not the right question to ask, are those concerns that spring from our disgust rational and therefore legitimate? I think what we need to ask is something more personal in a way. Do they make sense, those concerns? Do they make sense to us in the light of the complex of interrelated beliefs and feelings that define a specific way of living in and looking at the world? So it's a more reflective and more comprehensive and outward looking and also inward looking way of trying to figure out what is wrong with a certain action, a certain situation, and why. So reason is too narrow. Our rational faculties are too narrow in order to capture what is needed here. Okay, summary of what I tried to say. Reason certainly has a place in morality, but is not foundational. ultimate immorality needs to be anchored in our feelings. Disgust is not always reliable as an indicator of moral wrongness, but it still deserves to be taken seriously, seriously as a heuristic tool. Sometimes disgust is the only morally appropriate reaction to an action. Sense-making is more important than supposed reasonableness. So what I try to highlight in the previous slide is that sense-making is an important part of what we do when we engage in reflection, in moral reflection or ethical reflection. But sense-making is not just applying reason or rationality. It's more than that. Okay, that's it from me. Thank you very much for listening. Anyone got any questions or comments?
Thank you very much, Michael.
Or here a few papers that I wrote on
you cannot hear,
topics.
you know, the real applause as in a normal class, but thanks, that was really interesting. I see Margot having her hand up. Do you want to ask a question?
Should I click on the?
Yeah,
it's okay.
Or how does it work?
Do you
Okay.
see?
I just had a question. So when you were going over the example with the two ethicists, I'm sorry if I didn't say that correctly, but how they both can go in two different ways of like in the decision making of disgust. You know how one was saying that in terms of like doing infant mortality, it wasn't like disgusting, but one would go the other way. Is the reason being, would that be because of sense making? So it's not like you're making one decision, it's the sense making that causes the reason behind it. Am I kind of like making sense? Is it because it seemed like they can't really ever decide upon like one right and one wrong because of like the degree of like inadequacy? Is it so do they just rely on sense making to make their decisions? Is that like what would it be? Or I don't know, I was just confused. So that was my one question.
So I'm a bit confused too. I'm not entirely sure
Okay.
what you're getting at. But by sense making, I don't mean we need to apply some particular ethical theory, right?
Okay.
So it's not that we have to think about what the utilitarian says and what the Kantian says and then make up our mind who is right.
Okay.
Rather, what I was trying to say is that this doesn't help us in any way.
Mm-hmm.
Right? For instance, if we want to decide what is wrong with treating dead people as if they were just dead meat or just any kind of material, right?
Yeah.
What is wrong with that? We need to think about what it means and what the dead body of someone who was loved by people and known by people, what does it represent? To what extent is that a representation of the real human being? What interests are there? What feelings are being hurt or brought into play when this is no longer there? Would perhaps the way we treat the dead, if we treated the dead differently, would that affect the way we treat the living? Mm-hmm. So these are the questions we would have to ask in order to figure out why that might be important to do, treating the dead with respect, mm-hmm. even though there doesn't seem to be a rationally compelling reason for it.
Yeah, there's just basically more things to take into account. Like that made sense to me when you said like it's someone's loved one. You don't just look at the fact of the matter that this is a dead body. You have to take other perspectives. Okay, I get what you're saying. So that would be okay. That makes sense.
Okay.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Is there anyone in class who wants to ask the question? Of course, also people who don't belong to the literal class, just anyone who is here. I remind you, you can also type your question in case you don't feel like talking directly.
Also happy if you have questions later on. You can always send me an email and I try my best to answer them. Yeah,
that's very nice of you. It's very generous. But while I'm waiting, I have one question for you.
Of course, yeah.
Do you imagine other feelings and sentiments that are strongly moral? Have you
feelings and sentiments that are strongly moral?
Right.
as such, independent of the situation, independent of the context.
That, like disgust, so that can be our, thermometer to say, this is not right. You can talk to me as much as you wanted, but I will not trust you in believing that this is right.
Well, first of all, disgust very often is not a moral feeling at all, because
Yeah.
it's purely physical, right? But when it is moral, it can also be immoral. So if you say it's a moral feeling in the sense that it has some moral implication, then perhaps a particular kind of disgust is moral as a moral feeling, right? But I don't think there are feelings that are always morally good.
Yeah.
Right? I don't know. Well, what examples could we give? Anger, for instance. Anger can be very important, right? You can be angry because someone is treated very, very badly. And then again, it's a good thing that you feel that anger, and that anger can be an important force for good and prompt you, motivate you to do the right thing. And if you didn't feel any anger, then it would show that, again, something is morally wrong with you. But of course, anger can also be misplaced and can lead you to do things that are not right. But also seemingly good emotions, such as, say, love or compassion, perhaps. I mean, there are good versions of compassion and bad ones. The bad one is usually called pity, and then some people might resent it or think that is misplaced. So perhaps we have good and bad variations of the same emotion, or perhaps we call them by different names depending on the situation and whether it is morally appropriate or not, you know. But I think it's always important to consider the context and the situation as a whole. The same holds for actions. There's no action that is in itself always wrong or right. It always depends on the context. Context is what makes an action right or wrong.
Yeah.
Which of course makes ethics very difficult, because you cannot really say this is what is right and this is what is wrong. It depends. It depends on the situation, because we live in a complex world, and we need to take the complexity of the world in which we live into account when we interact with other people and decide what we should do. You know?
And it has to remain complex. In this class we had, I don't know if with these students or another class, we had a discussion about complexity. And we need to save complexity, because
yes,
yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
If we make everything simple, then we lose who we are.
And there's a very strong tendency in bioethics to get rid of complexity, right?
Yeah.
All those thought experiments like trolley cases and so on, they are designed to exclude all the contingent factors, which in any real situation are there, right? So it's very, very artificial, and we are never in a situation that bioethicists use in order to test our moral intuitions. In any real situation, the fact there are so many factors that might change the way we feel about what is right to do here and what is not. And perhaps also there is no universal answer. Perhaps there is a situation, and in its complexity, there is no right or wrong. There might be better and worse answers, but nothing where you can say, yes, that is the right thing. There might be a situation where whatever you do, you hurt someone, or you do something that is bad in some way.
Yeah. And we are not in a rush.
You need to remember.
I mean, we can take the time to consider all the angles of the situation.
Yeah.
Thanks. I have Filippo Contesi who wants to ask a question.
Hi, can you hear me? I'm not sure. It's the first time I'm using this.
It's perfect.
I can hear you, but
Okay,
I can't see you.
Well,
I only see a chair.
yeah,
Okay.
oh, a chair. Okay, so that's why. So do you see me
Oh,
now?
now I can see you. Yeah.
All right.
Okay, sorry,
Perfect.
because I don't get my own video. Yes, I was. Yeah, sorry. I mean, this was great. I'm not part of
No problem.
the class. Can I ask you something about this sense making thing? I mean, so I guess a couple of things. One is it reminded me very much of. So when people talk in philosophy of emotions of the formal objects of disgust, they usually say that formal objects, so something like, you know, disgust has the formal object of disgustingness, something like that, right? So it's the property that makes some object raise the emotion that it does.
Mm-hmm.
And so people sometimes say, so usually they say formal objects are useful because they identify that emotion as opposed to different emotions. So say disgust as opposed to fear, and also appropriateness conditions. So if it's not disgusting, then you shouldn't feel disgust. If it's disgusting, then you should feel disgust. But then I was also, so there's someone called Fabrice Teroni in Geneva, and he said something like, we need to distinguish between appropriateness and intelligibility. So appropriateness is more, seems more like what you're referring to as rationality or something like that. Intelligibility sounds very much like your sense-making concept. So I guess the first, so, you know, does it make sense? I guess it's the intelligibility condition for Teroni. So I was just wondering, you know, that's just maybe a suggestion for links with the previous literature, or a request for comment if you know about the intelligibility condition. The other thing is more of a question to you. I mean, so one of the things that you said was problematic with using rationality as a ground for morality was that in the Minerva Giubilini case, they were saying this is rational. The anti-abortion person was saying, no, my argument was rational. And that seemed like there was an impasse, or it was difficult to adjudicate between the two different claims. But then wouldn't that be even more of a problem when you talk about sense making? Because it seems
when you talk
at
about
least when you talk about sense making, your concept, right? Yeah. Because if I'm understanding sense making roughly along the lines of this is intelligible, makes sense, the sense that I have is that it would even be more controversial what makes sense to whom, right? There's going to be way more conflict between different groups of people for whom something makes sense or doesn't make sense, right? Then in the case of reason, at least in the case of reason, there's logic, there's some sort of a tradition, at least, that supports establishing between which is correct between two arguments. In sense making, the moral conflicts are going to go haywire, right? There's going to be a much more moral conflict and much less possibility to adjudicate between in the conflict.
Yeah, I see your point. It's a very good point. But frankly, I don't think it's possible to have more disagreement than we already have these days. But of course, the reason for that is that people make sense of things in very different ways. Again, you're right. There are various ways of making sense of situations. And so it's not a foolproof method of getting over moral disagreements. And it's not meant to be. I'm not saying that we can get rid of disagreements by doing that. It's more about finding out for us what is right and wrong. So it's about, should we let ourselves be deterred by an apparent lack of rational justification? Or are there other ways of making sense? Because ultimately the rational justification is always missing or is always flawed, is never logically compelling. Always there is an exercise of sense making that is needed. Now, how do we do this? Right? I know it's not a very vague notion. It's not precise at all. Which again has to do with the fact that the world that we have to address, that we have to make sense of, is complex. But it seems to me that what we need to ask is the question, ultimately the most relevant moral questions are, who do I want to be, and in what kind of world do I want to live? And hopefully in answering those questions, we find other people and can convince them that our vision of the world is better than theirs. But as we know very well, that is not often the case, and today we live in times where this seems to be less the case than ever before. But I'm sorry, I don't have an answer to how to get to bridge those severe disagreements. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Sorry, I can't hear you, Susie. I can't hear you.
Thank you. Yeah, I was muted.
Now I can hear you. Yeah.
Sure. So I have one more question from Jana. I hope I pronounce well your name. And she writes, Rosi Braidotti talks about embodiment of the brain, embrainment of the body, describing the way mind is a combination of reason and feeling, the way knowledge is gathered through the body as well as brain. Is it a useful concept, this one here? She asks.
So can you repeat the question?
Absolutely. So Rosi Braidotti talks about embodiment of the brain and embrainment
of the body. I got this part. What was the question at the end?
So just a part of the question is this concept useful here?
I'm not entirely sure how it would be useful. I completely agree that we are embodied creatures, and that this also always has to be taken into account. But I'm not quite sure how this would answer the question to what extent morality can be rationally justified. Certain moral norms can be rationally justified.
Mm-hmm. Let me know if you have more questions or if you have follow-up questions. We still have 5 minutes.
Do you mean me, or are you talking to the participants?
To the class, yeah. Well, in case you have questions for them, why not?
Yeah, no, I'm not right now then.
Giving a little bit of time. So Jana, for Jana is okay.
All right.
Here. So thank you very much for your presentation, and it really made the point for what I'm trying to do. Yeah, I'm trying to bring.
You're welcome. Thank you very much, Susie, for having me. It's been good.
Yeah. And so, yeah, in case you happen to have a question in a day or two, because, yeah, you are thinking about what we said here, why not? I'm happy that Michael generously shared part of his time online, so you can email me and I will email him. You have his email, you my students, online under online lectures for this session, so you can consult the PowerPoint.
You can email me directly, that's perfectly fine.
Okay, so I put your email address also on
that's fine.
online lectures. Thank you so much.
Okay, you're welcome.
And so, thank you.
All right.
Thank
Have a nice day,
much for
everyone.
being here. Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yes, I saw that you have a question. I read only Alorios, 96.
I don't have a question, sorry.
Okay, I saw you about to raise your hand.
Oh no, I was saying bye to him.
Okay, bye everyone. Have a good day.
Have a good day.